They called it the war to end all wars, but those who lived through it knew better. In the silence that followed the final gunshot, the world was not healed. It was stunned, numbed, changed forever. Across the globe, families stood by empty chairs. Names carved into stone became the only remaining trace of lives once full of laughter and promise. Veterans returned home, but not as they had left. They carried invisible wounds, memories they could not speak of, and questions they would never answer. Some never spoke of the war again, others tried to describe it and failed. Language, it seemed, had no words for the things they had seen. And yet, life moved forward. Cities were rebuilt. Fields were sown again. Children were born, and with them came the hope of a future not defined by gunfire. But underneath that fragile hope lay the weight of unspoken truths. The peace treaties that followed the war were not just about rebuilding. They were about controlling, about drawing lines, setting conditions, and assigning blame. The victors imposed penalties that crippled economies and wounded national pride. One nation in particular bore the brunt of that punishment. Once powerful and proud, it was now humiliated, economically shattered, and politically unstable. Within that wounded nation, resentment grew. Pride twisted into anger, despair turned to desperation, and into that desperation stepped voices promising restoration. They offered a return to greatness, a revival of identity, a scapegoat for every pain. The seeds of the next great conflict were planted not in secret but in plain sight, watered by the failures of peace. Elsewhere, the world watched. Some tried to rebuild a better system. Organizations were formed with the dream of preventing future wars. Diplomats met, debated, and drafted resolutions. But the world had changed too much and too quickly. Old powers struggled to adjust. New powers emerged, hungry and bold. The balance was shifting. In colonies across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, the war had changed perceptions. Soldiers from these regions had fought and died in battles that were not their own. They returned with questions. Why should they fight for empires that denied them rights? Why should they serve kings who saw them as lesser? Movements for independence began to rise. The world was awakening to its own inequality. In the Americas, the war stirred both pride and isolation. A distant nation, once reluctant to engage in foreign affairs, found itself thrust into a leadership role. Its industries had boomed during the war, its troops had tipped the balance. But its people remained cautious. They had seen the cost of foreign entanglement, and honestly, they sought instead to turn inward, hoping oceans could shield them from the world's chaos. And while the war had ended, the battles within continued. Veterans struggled with poverty, addiction, and silence. Women who had stepped into roles once denied to them found themselves pushed back into the margins. Progress had knocked on the door, but tradition stood firm in its defense. Yet something had changed. The veil had been lifted. The world had seen what modern war looked like. It had heard the screams of children beneath collapsed homes, seen the shattered minds of men once full of promise, and tasted the bitterness of promises broken. The war also gave rise to artists, poets, and thinkers who reshaped culture. Through paint and pen, they captured the rawness of experience. They questioned authority, tradition, and the very idea of progress. They did not write to glorify, but to expose. Their work was not about pride, but about warning that humanity had touched something monstrous and might reach for it again. One cannot speak of the war that shaped the world without speaking of its echoes. It was not a single event, but a chain reaction. Every treaty, every rebellion, every economic collapse in the years that followed could be traced back to it. It was the stone thrown into a calm lake, sending ripples that would not stop for decades. And yet, amidst the devastation, something remarkable occurred. Nations that once saw each other only as enemies began to meet not on battlefields but across tables. There were efforts, however flawed, to build something better, a world not ruled by force but by cooperation. These were early steps, fragile and incomplete, but steps nonetheless. Generations passed and, well, the memories began to fade. Monuments were built, speeches were given. But the true lessons risked being lost beneath layers of ceremony, for the war that shaped the world was never just about borders or battles. It was about the human cost of pride, the danger of unchecked power, and honestly, the fragility of peace. As the world entered new eras with new technologies and new threats, the shadows of that war remained, in the policies of nations, in the fears of leaders, and in the eyes of those who study history not as a story, but as a warning. We are reminded that war is not an accident, it is not inevitable, it is the result of choices, of silence when voices should be raised, of arrogance when humility is needed, and of cruelty allowed to grow unchecked. The war that shaped the world may seem distant to those who live today, but it is not. Its echoes are in the headlines, in the refugee camps, in the arms races, in the walls built between nations and people, and its lesson is clear. We must remember. Remember the young men who never came home, the cities turned to rubble, the ideals betrayed. Remember not just with ceremony, but with action. Not just in books, but in decisions. As long as we remember, we have a chance to build something better. A world where conflict is resolved not with bombs, but with dialogue. Where justice is not about revenge, but about restoration. Where no child is asked to carry a weapon for a cause they do not understand. The war that shaped the world was a tragedy. But it was also a turning point, a moment where humanity saw itself, its glory, its horror, its potential. What we do with that memory defines who we become. History does not repeat itself. People do, but only if they forget. Only if they ignore the warnings written in blood and sorrow. Let us not forget. Let the war that shaped the world be more than a chapter in a book. Let it be a mirror. Let it be a reminder. Let it be the reason we reach for peace, even when war seems easier. Let it be the voice that speaks when silence tempts us. Let it be the lesson we carry in our actions, not just our thoughts, for the world was once broken, and it was rebuilt not by kings or generals alone, but by ordinary people who refused to let hatred define the future. That spirit lives on in us. We owe it to the past and we owe it to the future. Let us remember. Let us choose better. Let us never forget the war that shaped the world. If you like this content, please support the channel by hitting the subscribe button and, like and comment below.